Hello, I'm Shank, and this is the Real Boy. It's the world's first handheld Virtual Boy, and it took me almost a year to build. Make no mistake, this is not a Virtual Boy emulator. Inside this handheld is an actual Virtual Boy motherboard from a damaged Virtual Boy, along with lots of custom hardware, electronics, and code. This project is one of the most difficult and ambitious projects I've ever taken on. Being the first of its kind, I had countless unexpected issues and setbacks that pushed me to the edge of just giving up on this project.
Oh, it was 30 volts. No. My screen's probably cooked. So, I've never seen anything like this. Look, AC interference is what triggers it.
But that leaves a lot of questions. How is this all possible? And why, of all consoles, did I choose to build a portable out of Nintendo's biggest commercial failure to date? For those new to my channel, my most common builds are turning Wiis into portable gaming systems. I've built a few portable Wiis throughout the years, but before I entered the portabilizing community, Wii motherboard trimming and Wii handhelds weren't really a thing. When I first set out to document the Wii circuit board and make my first portable Wii, I knew next to nothing about electronics. Everything was new, uncomfortable, and confusing. But the challenges I faced making my first portable forced me to learn in order to overcome them, and I was picking it up and learning faster than I could ever imagine. But after completing a few Wii portables, I've gotten pretty comfortable with the process. A little bit too comfortable. I discovered that when it comes to learning, when you start getting comfortable, you stop getting better. So, after finishing the GameCube Joy-Cons, I knew it was time for me to experiment with a project that would put me outside of my comfort zone. And nothing says uncomfortable quite like the Virtual Boy. Not everyone knows about the Virtual Boy, and honestly, who can blame them? Before starting this project, I had never owned or even used a Virtual Boy. Released in 1995, it was Nintendo's first attempt at 3D virtual reality gaming. The history of this console is fascinating. After Nintendo obtained exclusive licensing rights to RTI's LED eyepiece tech in the early 90s, they set out to create an ambitious 3D virtual reality project. Led by the legend Gunpei Yokoi himself, the project, codenamed VR32, was going to change the way the world saw video games. But then Nintendo's corporate leaders got bored of the project. They slashed VR32's R&D budget and reassigned most of the dev team. Upper management wanted something to release during the gap between the Super Nintendo and their upcoming Ultra 64, and pushed for an early release date. To meet the new release window and budget restrictions, the scope of the project was scaled back tremendously, and the Virtual Boy was rushed out the door in 1995. It was a commercial flop, only selling around 700,000 units. It was promptly discontinued less than a year later. The Virtual Boy is neat, unique, and ambitious, but the technology just wasn't there in 1995. It feels like a rushed prototype rather than a complete market-ready product. But more importantly, it has a small library of decent, exclusive games that never saw the light of day on another system. Today, it has hidden gems, a cult following, and a surprisingly active homebrew modding scene. So how exactly does this red and black abomination even work? Let's crack it open and have a look. Here in the middle we have the motherboard. This board has the processors and circuitry that run the Virtual Boy games. As a result, it is the most important part for this build, as it is the only part I cannot replace with custom circuitry. If I did, it wouldn't be a Virtual Boy anymore. On each side we have one of two eyepieces with a vertical row of tiny red LEDs. Light is bounced off these mirrors towards the user. Servo motors attached to the mirrors make them go 50 times a second, turning the row of LEDs into what our eyes see as a square raster. By turning on and off the LEDs at the precise moment synchronized with the mirrors, these LED rows effectively become tiny red and black screens. Down here we have the servo board, which, as the name implies, controls the servo motors used on the mirrors. The motherboard communicates with the servo board, and the console will actually refuse to boot if the servo board or the motors are not present. On the left we have a board with the audio amp for the built-in speakers, and a board for the controller and link cable plugs. But Shank, I hear you furiously typing. Isn't the Virtual Boy already portable? It was marketed as a portable device, with batteries to power it stored in the controller. but calling it portable is a bit of a stretch. It's pretty clunky and requires a table and chair to even use it. It constantly nags you to take breaks, and its literature has warnings all over it. And while it probably won't give me eye cancer, it isn't particularly comfortable to look at. A play session feels about the same as falling asleep with my contacts in. Now that we understand how it works, how can we improve it and make it portable? The obvious solution would be to... But honestly, I'd like to go for something a little more traditional and pocketable. Nobody has ever built a Virtual Boy handheld before, so I had a lot of figuring out to do. But before we go into the changes I made, first let's talk about the specific parts that make up game consoles. Nearly every video game console in existence is made up of the same 6 essential building blocks. The first and most important portion of the console is the main circuit board, also known as the motherboard or the MOBO. This is the heart and brain of the video game console, and makes the console what it is. It consists of all the processing chips needed for the console to operate, and it connects to the 5 other building blocks. First, on the input side, we have power. This block consists of the power source, such as outlets or batteries, along with the circuitry needed to convert it into something the console can use. Next, we have the game. This includes not just the data of the game itself, but the medium that is used to load it. This can be a hard drive, game cartridge, flash drive, disk drive, or anything really, depending on the game system. The last input is the controller. This is pretty straightforward and includes all the buttons, sticks, and electronics needed for you to play and interact with the game. On the other side, we have the output blocks. The video block consists of the TV or screen, along with the entire video signal chain. The last block is audio, which consists of the speakers and the amplifiers needed to drive them. Every video game system, home or handheld, is made up of these same 6 blocks. As mentioned before, the motherboard is the game system itself. It cannot be replaced by custom parts, or would not be the same game console. However, the other 5 blocks can, and replacing these 5 segments is the key to transforming any video game console into a smaller, more portable system. So now that we understand these segments, let's have a look at the blocks that make up the Virtual Boy and see what we can do to change and improve them. First, we have the motherboard. There's no getting around this one. If you want a Virtual Boy portable, you need to use a Virtual Boy motherboard, and the only place to get a Virtual Boy motherboard is from inside an actual Virtual Boy. Rather than harvest a perfectly working one, I was given a board that was severely damaged from another modder's attempt to repair it. One eyepiece data is totally fried, so one eye will never work again. Fortunately, I only need the data from one of the 2 eyes, so this board is perfect to resurrect into a functional portable. The next obstacle to tackle is the games. The Virtual Boy uses cartridges to load and play games. On most portables, the goal is to replace the disk drive or cartridge slot with something more compact that can store an entire library of games. Unfortunately, there just isn't a way to do that on the Virtual Boy, at least not yet. This means I'm stuck with using real, original cartridges. Luckily, the Virtual Boy's cartridge slot isn't too big, so I can work with that. The stock cartridge slot sits really far away from the motherboard, so it'll need to be modified and rewired. This is done by cutting down the slot with a Dremel and manually soldering wires to each of the 60 pins. This took several hours, but allowed me to reduce the thickness by a few millimeters. The Virtual Boy has a lot of homebrew games, including an excellent port of Street Fighter II called Hyperfight. To play these games, I'm going to use this reprogrammable cartridge called the HyperFlash 32. Notice anything funny about this label? It's not paper, it's actually an e-paper display. To program a different game onto the cartridge from the microSD slot, just plug in USB power, use the capacitive touch buttons on the back to select a game, and the cartridge will reprogram itself into that game, displaying community-made artwork when it's done. This slick, reprogrammable cartridge was designed and made by Melot, a well-respected contributor in the Virtual Boy modding scene. Huge shoutouts to him for sending me one so I can feature more games later in the video. Video on the Virtual Boy is a little more complicated. As we discussed earlier, the Virtual Boy doesn't have a screen, and also doesn't put out any standard video signal. Fortunately for me, a brilliant modder by the name of Furtek created an open source mod called the Virtual Tab. This board allows the Virtual Boy to output a VGA signal, which I can send to any standard VGA screen. The picture quality is great, and even supports changing color palettes with the push of a button. While the Virtual Boy itself supports stereoscopic 3D, the Virtual Tap doesn't. Implementing something custom with FPGAs on, say, a 3DS screen is possible, but far beyond my capabilities. The Virtual Tap kit also includes a servo emulator board. This tiny chip is programmed to trick the console into thinking the servo board is present and functional, telling it exactly what it wants to hear. For the controller, I didn't want to harvest the components from an actual Virtual Boy controller, and instead wanted to make my own. The Virtual Boy's controller is just a 16-bit shift register. Shift registers are simple, common chips that can still be purchased today. This means all I needed to do was buy a pair of 8-bit shift registers, wire them up, and call it a day. But there's one big problem. Sometimes I'm a little too ambitious for my own good. Over the years, my hardware and electronics capabilities have greatly improved as I have taken on more and more ambitious projects. But there's something you should know. I have a weakness. Something that has always held me back. Something, no matter how hard I try, I've never been able to overcome. It's time I tell you what has always been my greatest limiting factor as a modder. Coding. As long as I can remember, I have always struggled with software and coding. And this was an opportunity to force myself out of my comfort zone to learn something new. So my plan at this point was to take the functions of a shift register, add my own functions, and put them onto a tiny, reprogrammable chip known as a microcontroller. I wired up a breadboard, studied a several hundred-page datasheet, learned about SPI protocol, and just kidding, turns out interrupts on the chip aren't fast enough for my goal to even be possible. And it only took me a week of all-night troubleshooting sessions to figure it out. After my first hello world turned into a goodbye world, it was time for a new plan. Instead of putting everything on one chip, I was going to use normal shift registers and put my own custom chip between the buttons and the shift registers. This would let me monitor the buttons that are pressed and perform different actions if certain button combinations are pressed simultaneously. The downside to this approach is that I need 16 inputs and at least 16 outputs. I tried wiring this all up by hand, but it was messy and extremely unreliable. Instead, I designed a custom circuit board to develop my code on. Rather than running every wire by hand, circuit boards have tiny copper lines on them called traces. These traces act like flat wires to connect everything on the board where they need to go without turning your project into spaghetti. Custom circuit boards allow for slimmer, more organized, and more reliable circuits. In recent years, making custom circuit boards for one-off projects like this has become more and more accessible. There's free software to design the board, free tutorials to teach you how, and the circuit boards have become more affordable than ever. For example, with PCBWay, the sponsor for this video, you can get 10 PCBs of your own design for just $5. If you're interested in having your own professional circuit boards made, I recommend giving them a shot. They supplied the boards I used in this project, and even supplied a batch of these fun, decorative KEYCHAIN PCBs to give away at the end of the video. Once my development board arrived, I quickly assembled it and got to work. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, I lacked the coding experience needed to actually complete this project. Sometimes, though, all you need is a good teacher. Allow me to introduce the first hero of this project, CrashBash. He's a software engineer and close friend of mine who took me under his wing to help me complete the project. Him and I spent countless all-nighters over several weekends working through the software to get it right, streaming the entire process to my Discord server. He walked me through the entire process as we worked on more and more complex aspects of the code. At one point, the software for compiling just straight up stopped working on my computer, and Crash had to remotely write code and have me test it. Finally, after countless night owl sessions, we got all the code for the controller working properly, including all my bonus features. By pressing certain button combinations, I can change the color palette, adjust screen controls, and turn on and off LEDs. The controller is sorted out, so now we're playing with power. The Virtual Boy is normally powered by 6 AA batteries. Gross. For my project, I want to use the same high-capacity lithium cells found in modern electronics, so I will be using the N64 power management system. This open-source board was designed by G-Man for use in Nintendo 64 portables. but it's perfectly fit for this project. It has the lithium protection, battery management, and dual voltage power supplies I need to power this project. Since the power management system is open source, I was also able to tweak the code to tell the Virtual Boy to activate the in-game low battery indicator when the lithium batteries are low, with a little help from CrashBash, of course. Finally comes the last block, audio. While the audio amp that comes with the Virtual Boy would do the job, the board is pretty large and a lot of space could be saved by replacing it with a smaller amp. A suitable replacement would need to accept analog audio, work with speakers, and support headphone jack audio with automatic switching when plugged in. Once again, G-Man's open source PCBs come to the rescue with the UAMP, which checks every box on the list. The one caveat is that it uses digital volume controls. In other words, volume up and down buttons. For my build, I wanted to use an analog volume wheel for adjustment instead, which required some tweaking to the code. Crash and I gave it a go, but we encountered some of the strangest issues while doing so.
This is wacky.
We later learned that another modder, Stoned Edge, had already made such modifications to the UAMP code for another project, so he sent me his functional code to end our suffering. For any portable or project like this, the case is the last thing you want to design. It's important to design the case around your internals, rather than vice versa, for the cleanest, most efficient end result. I threw a sketch of the motherboard and a few screens into Illustrator, and drew mock-ups until I settled on this design. It's only slightly bigger than the motherboard, and is built around a 4.3-inch IPS widescreen display. After I figured out the shape, I added some visual flair to make it more reminiscent of the Virtual Boy. The front is stylized like the visor of the Virtual Boy, with the same red and black seams. I added a gray border to match the eye shroud, and colored the buttons to match the dark red translucent lenses for the eyepieces. For the back, I took inspiration from the other side of the Virtual Boy, matching the geometry and logo stylization. I feel the behavior of a controller's buttons isn't something you think about much until you hold a third-party controller and realize something has gone horribly wrong. For the shoulder buttons, I designed a modular system using 3 screw posts and an extremely satisfying semi-tactile switch. I spent a solid week tuning the design until it felt just right, somewhere between the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo 64 shoulder button. For the face buttons, I wanted to capture the oh-so-satisfying feel of the Game Boy Advance. I modeled the same button wells and used the same membranes to preserve the authentic feel. But official Game Boy Advance buttons don't come in the color I wanted, and third-party buttons just don't feel the same. Fortunately, an old friend of mine, Bassline, runs a business making custom controllers and controller parts. He was kind enough to resin cast some Forbidden Jolly Ranchers, buttons, in the color of my choice, and all I had to do was ask nicely.
Yes?
Where are my buttons?
I'm literally making them right now! Actually, I am. I'm making them right now!
Bassline is the coolest ape with a knife out there, and he makes fantastic controllers. If you're looking to get one made, I highly recommend checking him out. Next, I got to work 3D modeling the case in Autodesk Inventor. I found a 2DS-like wedge profile was not only comfortable, but the most efficient use of internal space for all the ports I wanted to have. For any well-designed portable, it's essential that the shell and its internals are built around each other. Custom printed circuit boards were the secret sauce to making a portable this clean and compact. This project uses a total of 11 circuit boards, 9 of which were custom, 6 of which I designed myself. This case and the boards were designed together to fit hand in hand, with matching screw posts and snap fits. The motherboard screws into the cart slot cover, with room on the sides for batteries, the thickest part of the portable. These 2 plates are screwed down on top of the motherboard, holding it in place while providing mounting points for most of the other circuit boards. Most parts are either screw-mounted or snap-fit, including the screen, which is held in from behind by carefully planned tolerances. The 2 halves of the case have snap fits along the edges, allowing it to snap closed without the use of screws. While designing the case, I also was designing these 6 custom PCBs specifically to fit in my case. Once I finished them, I uploaded them to PCBWay, customized them all to be red, and got them in the mail about a week later. This first PCB houses all the components needed for the controller I programmed on my dev board, along with the Pinocchio silkscreen, because he's a real boy. On the other side, I have contact pads for the D-pad and 4 face buttons, which I had gold-plated for improved responsiveness and reliability. It connects using a flex cable to another board that houses the other 6 face button contacts. The next PCB was used to mount the headphone jack, USB-C charging jack, and HDMI video out port. I also put my patrons' names on the back because y'all are super awesome and I appreciate every one of you. HDMI video output is achieved through a board I harvested from a VGA to HDMI converter cable. Rather than soldering 19 HDMI wires by hand, I designed an adapter PCB to easily run it straight to my I/O PCB. The last 2 boards serve no electrical purpose and only exist as mounting points for the volume wheel, controller port, and link cable. While it seems a little overkill, custom PCBs are really inexpensive, and these mounting boards were simple enough to design in a single night. As I've mentioned in my other videos, painting is not my specialty, and I wanted to avoid doing so for this project. Instead, my friend Mitch volunteered to print my project using multi-material 3D printing. Multi-material 3D printing lets you 3D print a single piece with multiple colors by splicing, welding, and feeding in different colors into the same extruder. The biggest downside to this is the 3D printer needs to print a large purge block to clear the extruder whenever it changes colors. This can be very wasteful. The other downside is the added complexity means getting a perfect print takes a lot more tuning. We went through 5 spools and lots of failed attempts before we had a final case I was satisfied with. Mitch was super patient with how picky I was, and he did a fantastic job helping me bring my vision to life. He has a YouTube channel and Twitter account where he showcases content and projects of his own. So if projects like these interest you, I highly recommend checking him out. When a case comes off the printer, it still needs a lot of post-processing to pretty it up. First up was sanding. I tried wet sanding by hand, a process I've utilized in previous projects, but found I got much better results wet sanding with a palm sander. I started with 220 grit and slowly worked my way up to 12,000. For our first attempt at the logo on the back, Mitch and I attempted to include it in the multi-material printing process. But the letters left tiny gaps that were too small to be filled by the printer, and trying to melt plastic into the holes only made things worse. Instead, Mitch cut some vinyl decals to use as painting stencils. Next, I picked up some primer, clear coat, tape, and other essential supplies I needed to finish up this case. Unfortunately, despite my best efforts, it was painting time. I peeled and applied the stencil and wrapped it in tape to protect the rest of the case. I applied a few coats of primer, then peeled away the tape and stencil, leaving nice clean letters. Then I just applied a few coats of clear coat to the case to protect the letters and waited a few days for it to dry. Finally, it was time to assemble everything. This was the culmination of everything I had worked on over the past few months. So much effort into careful planning and design meant the process was straightforward and planned out. Once the majority of the space-consuming parts were installed, it was time to finally close the case, and it didn't close. Throughout the entire design process, I had tested these snap fits on cases I printed on my 3D printer. But Mitch's 3D printer, the printer that had printed the final case, had different parameters that I had not accounted for. When printed on his printer, the snap fits closed, but they didn't have as much clamp force as mine, meaning it couldn't hold the case together when it was full. The design had to be tweaked, and the case had to be remade, and the internals would need to be transplanted. This was crushing to my morale, but I was going to finish this project if it killed me. I wasted no time tweaking the case to fix it. Mitch, the hero he is, got right to work on printing the new cases for me with my modified design. Once I had a solid printed case, I sanded it to 12,000 grit, applied a stencil, applied primer, clear coat, and let it dry again. Now with case number 2 in hand, it was time to remove the internals from the old case and reassemble them in the new one, hopefully for the last time. And now for the moment of truth. Success. Finally, after almost a year of work, the Real Boy. Real Virtual Boy hardware, real Virtual Boy games, all in a handheld, pocketable form factor. It has all the features you could ask for in a modern portable. USB-C charging, headphone jack, IPS screen, HDMI video output, external controller support, it has it all. I even included the Virtual Boy link cable port, just in case I ever meet someone else with a Virtual Boy. The multi-material 3D printed case and glowing resin cast buttons pay homage to the original Virtual Boy design. Button combinations allow me to adjust screen controls, change the color palette, and even enable an RGB mode. This project pushed me to the limits on all fronts, but I couldn't be more proud of the results. As part of the sponsorship for this video, I was able to convince PCBWay to fund a small giveaway to showcase how versatile their custom PCBs are. This double-sided GameCube Joy-Con keychain is a printed circuit board I designed myself. I had PCBWay make a metric crap ton of these for me, so I can give them away for free until I run out. Here's how you can get one. I recently set up a PO box. All you have to do is send a letter and include a stamped, self-addressed return envelope. Simple as that. When I get the letter, I'll open it, drop the keychain in the return envelope, and send it back. Check the description for more detailed instructions. I plan to continue to give these out until I run out. You don't have to include anything else in the envelope, but letters, art, and other goodies are certainly welcome. Behind every video I upload is months of work, which is why I only upload a few times a year. I read as many of the comments as I can, and all the kind words, support, and art have kept me motivated to push through to the end. Thank you to everyone who has liked, subscribed, and shared my videos. It really does make a difference. I have many more projects in the pipeline I'm really excited about, but in the meantime, you can check out my Discord server, Twitter, and Instagram to see what I'm up to. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next project.